if you're watching when this video goes live, it's just a few days away from the 4th of July. So that it seems like a great time to be talking about Walt Disney's Johnny Tremain, which we see here on the cover of the Walt Disney magazine. This is my favorite of the more obscure Disney live-action films. It seems like it's a shame it's not more well known. It's very well done, and it's all about the Revolutionary War, and there just aren't that many movies about that time period. So it's very interesting. But we'll come back to Johnny Tremain a little bit later, because actually we're going to be talking about coloring books today. And I hope you've brought your 64 crayon box with the built-in sharpener, because you're going to need it. Because what we're really going to talk about is giant coloring books. Now this, as you know, is the standard size for a coloring book. And this was released in 1957. So this is very much the size and the format that we think of as a coloring book. In 1932 was the first Disney coloring book, which was, of course, centered on Mickey Mouse. That was published by the Southfield Company. As things went on, Western Publishing, one of the big Disney licensees, became the main publisher of Disney coloring books under their Whitman imprint. There were even Whitman crayons. But what's really interesting is that in the 1930s, the Disney coloring books were oversized, much larger than this. So I thought it would be fun to take a look at those. The first one we have here is called Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and All Their Pals. And this was published in 1937. But it's interesting to note here that there's this little burst, because it says special edition from 1930's original publication. This means it was a reprint, and these were published during the 1970s. So in addition to coloring pages, which I'll definitely show you here, for instance this page here, and these pages here, we have quite a number of stories, and you can certainly color their illustrations. And it's a little bit of a different format from what we think of as a coloring book. So they were really trying to be very creative. And it was probably before the standard format for a coloring book was set. We think of coloring books, as you well know, as having these big drawings, one per page, really. Lots of white space for you to color with your crayons, your paints, your colored pencils, or whatnot. But these stories were an attempt to make this particular volume a little different. So I believe most of these stories, if not all, are from the Mickey Mouse magazine that was published in the 1930s. They repurposed them to make this as much of a book that you can read as a book that you can color. So it really makes it very fun. Another example of this oversized size is this Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck gag book, also published in 1937. So this one, as the title indicates, has lots of jokes, lots of fun illustrations with some jokes to amuse you. Here's a really fun one. Wouldn't it be fun to color Donald? He's playing baseball, obviously. And he says, boy, oh boy, if I ever miss this one, it'll be a sit-down strike. Here we have Mickey saying, quick, Dippy, hand me the net. I've got him, when it's really clear that this giant fish is in charge. And, of course, Mickey is calling who we would think of as Goofy. He's calling him Dippy Dog, because that was Goofy's original name. So there's some really fun jokes and some fun illustrations for you to color. Here's some riddles in the back with Goofy or Dippy, and it's really fun. It's another reprint, as we can tell from this burst here. And on the back here It shows all 6 of the reproductions that were done in the 1970s. And I'll read you what it says. A nostalgic look at the past. The illustrations for these books originated on the drawing boards of staff artists and animators at the Walt Disney Studios during the 1930s. Note each title carries the original year of publication. Another example I have here, again, a reproduction, is Mickey Mouse Presents a Walt Disney Silly Symphony, book to color. This was published in 1934, and it repurposes art from the Silly Symphony Sunday comic page, which at its start in 1932 starred Bucky Bug. How many of you have heard of Bucky Bug? He's actually a favorite character of mine. And he's based on the characters in the 1932 Silly Symphony entitled Bugs in Love. That's what inspired this character and his friends. So here's Bucky, and here's his friend Old Man Bo Bug, who's a friendly tramp. And they kind of team up and go to this wonderful little town that's populated by bugs and make their home there. And Bucky meets his girlfriend there. Her name is June Bug. Isn't that cute? So if we look inside, we see that indeed it is art from the Silly Symphony Sunday page. And this art was repurposed a lot over the years. In the Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck coloring books of this era, they also repurposed the art from the Mickey Mouse comic strip and Sunday page, and for Donald from the Silly Symphony Sunday page, because Donald was a star of that Sunday comic until he got his own comic strip in 1938. So these are really fun drawings, and as I said, Bucky is, to me, a really fun character. It's really interesting because he did become very popular in Walt Disney's Comics and Stories, the flagship monthly Disney comic book. Starting in 1943, Bucky and his friends were in brand new stories, and they were published until 1950. And then they, of course, were reprinted later on. So he really became a very popular character. It's fun to revisit his comic book stories because they really are a lot of fun. He and the other characters always spoke in rhyming dialogue to sort of indicate that they came from the Silly Symphonies, which of course were based on music as their central theme. But in case anybody asks you, did Bucky Buck have his own coloring book? Yes, he did in the 1930s. And then this was republished in the 1970s, as I said. So one tip for collectors, if you are looking on eBay or another similar site and see these coloring books for sale, be sure and look for this purple burst, because that indicates these are reprints. You will often see on eBay these being represented as having been published in the 1930s and therefore with higher prices because they're supposedly older. You can find the originals. They would not have this purple burst. Sometimes you will find the reproductions being represented as originals, probably not on purpose in most cases. They probably misunderstood. But do beware, because you don't want to buy a 1970s reprint thinking it's from the 1930s. So a great many coloring books were produced over the years, and as these coloring books indicate, Mickey Mouse and his friends were often the stars of those coloring books. But it's interesting to note that as Disney expanded into live-action films in the 1950s, there were coloring books based on the live-action films as well. So we have coloring books that represent Westward Ho! The Wagons, Old Yeller, even something like Son of Flubber, Savage Sam, etc. But again, they were the standard size coloring book. But perhaps to indicate the special nature of these live-action films that were produced at first, the live-action film coloring books were sometimes oversized. For example, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is certainly an epic film, had an oversized coloring book. And this brings us back to Johnny Tremain. Take a look at this. Isn't this wonderful? This oversized coloring book representing this truly unique and really very special Disney live-action film. Johnny Tremain was produced in 1957, and that's when this coloring book was issued to be in the stores at the same time as Johnny Tremain, the movie, was in the movie theaters. So let's take a look at this, a closer look. The first thing we might notice is that here it says Johnny Tremain is the hero of Esther Forbes' classic novel, Johnny Tremain. Esther Forbes was an author who specialized in the Revolutionary War era, the colonial era, in the history of the United States. She wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book that is a history of Paul Revere, a biography of that patriot whose name to us is very famous, but she did a lot of research and wrote a wonderful, very detailed book about that famous silversmith and that famous figure in the Revolutionary War. She took that research and also created a book for younger readers, a young adult book about Johnny Tremain, who is a fictional character who is kind of swept up in the events of the Revolutionary War. He is a silversmith's apprentice and does meet Paul Revere and other figures of the Revolutionary War. So this, of course, appealed to Walt Disney as a movie he could make about this young hero, and hopefully that would appeal to his family audience. And indeed, it's a really wonderful movie. Here's Johnny Tremain talking to Paul Revere. Here is the Boston Tea Party, some scenes from that. And again, what we think of as the standard coloring book format, large pictures that can be published, one per page. Here we have the Liberty Tree. And it's a pretty good representation of the Johnny Tremain movie. Kind of all the color and excitement of the Revolutionary War, except you have to add the color with your crayons. Here's Paul Revere's famous ride. The redcoats are coming. And it's just really cool that it's this great oversized coloring book. You didn't see this sort of size too much in the 1950s and really ever since. So it makes it a very special coloring book. So again, if you're watching this video when it first drops, it's almost the 4th of July. So I'd certainly like to wish everyone a happy Independence Day. Seek out Walt Disney's Johnny Tremain, probably a Disney movie you have not seen, and it's well worth looking at. There's plenty of Johnny Tremain on my blog, and also a D23 article that I wrote, and I'll put the link in the show notes for that article. And hopefully you can find a few minutes over the 4th of July holiday to take a look at that and discover Walt Disney's Johnny Tremain. I'd like to thank you for joining me, and please be with me next time when our guest will be Mr. Richard Fader from the Chamber of Commerce for Fort Lee, New Jersey. Just goes to show you, it's always something. See you then.